True.
Okay.
And we're good.
Okay. Well, Ian, thanks so much for jumping on the podcast today. I know personally I'm excited to talk with you. And I think the first time I began to follow you a little bit was, I guess, in 2013 when you were doing the Grand Slam, the Ultra Grand Slam. So I've been kind of following you since then. So excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me here, guys. It's always fun to chat about running. I do it all day long, and I never get bored.
That's great. Well, tell us a little bit of background and how you got started in running in the first place, Ian.
I was living in London. I'd been there for a few years after university, and I just realized I wasn't doing much exercise. So I was in that kind of mindset of thinking, I want to do something a bit more athletic and get back to how I used to be. It wasn't like I got out of shape hugely, but I wasn't exercising regularly. I'd never really been a runner. I did running within lots of team sports, but that was about it. And then I saw a TV documentary about a race in the Sahara Desert called the Marathon des Sables, which is a multi-stage race, about 150 miles running through the Sahara Desert. And I just liked the idea that it was going to this epic place that, it's the Sahara Desert. That's like, in my mind, the most famous desert in the world. So I'd never been there. I thought that'd be a good idea. It just happened to be running. It could have been, I don't know, biking or whatever, but it sounded like a good excuse to get into shape. So I then started running, started doing some marathons and things like that in the build up to it, just to see what it was like, and kind of liked it. So I then got very hooked and started doing about 30 or 40 races a year.
Wow. My word. So did you kind of know offhand right after you got started, you kind of know, hey, this is kind of coming natural to me? Did you experience some success early on as you started doing some of the races?
Not particularly. I mean, within the first couple of years, my marathon times were improving. So it's like with any runner, it's always motivating to see improvement along the way. But I remember one of the first marathons I went to, there's a club in the UK called the 100 Marathon Club, and it means that you've done 100 marathons, and they've got their running shirts on, and it says that. And I remember seeing them. It's just a bunch of old dudes, basically. And I thought, that's never going to be me. And like 3 years later, it was
me. Do you love doing just multiple distances? I mean, I saw you've done some shorter races. Of course, you do the ultras. Is it just kind of, hey, you just like to do all types of distances?
Basically, I mean, it's about variety. It's what keeps it interesting. So summertime tends to be a bit more focused on the mountains because that's when the snows melt. That's when the races are. And I like 100 milers. So that tends to be the summer mainly. And then after that, you feel a little bit slow. You've not been doing a whole lot of speed work in between 100 milers. So it's nice to switch to something faster. So I'm now kind of building up to marathons, and I'd like to go for a marathon PR next year. And then there's a big road race in South Africa that I've done a few times called Comrades, 55 miles. So I'm going back to that. And so I'm really focused more on speed for a little bit. And then by the summer, it'll get back to distance a bit more.
Gotcha. But did you just do the Las Vegas Marathon recently?
I did. Yeah. I've been to Vegas plenty of times, but right. The idea of running down the strip when there aren't cars and things, because every time you go to Vegas, it's a crappy place to run. I mean, you basically have a treadmill, or you can get out of town. There's stuff. There's, some nice trails and things like that, but it's usually too hot. But running along the strip is absolutely horrible. So the idea of doing that when it's all closed down, that was kind of fun. So I did that, and I've done a few Guinness World Record attempts in marathons before. So I hold the fastest Elvis record at the moment. And I was going for that again. I thought if I'm going to do Elvis again, kind of has to be Vegas. So that's what I was doing. I was running along, as a lot of other people were, in an Elvis suit. But with the difference that I had to do, I think it was 2:42 was the time I needed. And unfortunately, it was super windy, like ridiculously windy. I've never been to a windier marathon. I've done over 100 road races like that. And that was the windiest race I've ever done. So the last 8 miles was just into a headwind, and my V neck down to my belly button on the Elvis onesie basically was like a sail. So not particularly pleasant conditions.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the conditions, and I was emailed Andrew Limoncello, I think, who won that race, and he was telling me it was as brutal as the conditions as he's ever run a marathon.
Well, he was aiming to qualify for the UK for the Olympics for the marathon, so he needed to run about a 2:13. And he was on that for maybe 8 or 9 miles. Then I heard that he just kind of said, not going to happen today. So he slowed down a lot in the second half, but he was the only person under 2:30, even though there were some very fast guys there.
Is that traditionally a windy race, or is that a little bit
I
unusual
don't
for
think
Las
so.
Vegas?
No, I think they just
Yeah.
had a storm come in. I mean, Vegas is just hot, is what you'd expect, and then at that time of year,
Yeah.
maybe a tiny bit of wind, but not any more than any other race, I don't think.
Yeah. Now, was the Elvis costume? We got to ask: is it kind of custom? Is it one you've kind of pulled off the shelf? Is it tough to run
It
in?
is
Or
in no way customized. It is just a cheap, nasty, like polyester type of thing. It chafed a bit. You have to wear a lot of Vaseline or something similar to deal with that. But I didn't realize it had a little zip down the front at the bottom of the big V-neck, and that's how you get in and out. And I didn't lube up around there, so I got chafing around my belly from that. But
oh
luckily,
God,
nothing else too bad. But yeah, they don't make running costumes for that type of thing, so
yeah.
it's just cheap stuff that you'd wear to a party. And then I try and adjust it slightly. Like the flares were a bit too big, so I use some staples to reduce the size of the flares.
Now, do you have I know you've run in several costumes. Do you have a favorite one that's more comfortable than others to run in?
Normally, I like the Elvis one, the old Elvis costume I had that I kind of ruined by using too much. That one was more comfortable. This was probably the least comfortable one I've ever worn. But I've done a Spider-Man one quite a few times, and the main difficulty is it covers your face. So I had to cut a slit so I could eat and drink. But other than that, it's not actually that difficult. It's just you've got almost no visibility because you've got these little slits for your eyes like that.
Oh.
So if someone's running next to you, unless they say something or make a noise, you don't know they're there.
Now, was what was the first ultra marathon that you did, Ian?
It was London to Brighton. So that is it's actually the final year of that event. So it was a classic road race in the UK. It's, I think, 54 miles from London to Brighton, which is on the coast. And it's got some hills in there as well. But it had been going for 50 or 60 years. The organizers were getting quite old, and so they tried to pass it on to other people but couldn't find people. So that was 2005. So that was before I went to the desert. That was my one and only ultra before trying that. And I just, again, it surprised me. I thought it would be so much harder than it was. And it's not like it was easy, but it's more you just realize what the body's capable of. Right. So you do it and go, oh, okay, well, if that's possible, then something else even above that's possible. And you start realizing, and I think that's probably one of the biggest steps you take as a runner. And it's someone who's training for a 10K. Maybe they think that that's an impossible distance. They've never run before. They run a couple of miles and it's impossibly difficult. Then a couple of weeks later, 2 miles is easy. And each step it allows you to get to the next step, and you realize what your body can do if you just give it a little bit of time to adapt and train.
So how was the desert run for you?
That first one did not go well. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never heard of hyponatremia. I had no idea about hydration and eating. And I think I was wearing a pair of baggy tennis shorts. You know, it wasn't exactly the best gear that I had. And so after the first day, I'd been drinking all of the water that they provide. So you have to bring your own food, but they provide water. And I drank all of it. And I got hyponatremia. So I basically drowned myself in the desert. Then the second day, as soon as I stood up for the first time in the morning, I immediately fainted. And then a couple of hours later at the start line, they were doing announcements at the start, and I fainted in that area as well. So I then walked through that day. There were horrific sandstorms, really nasty conditions where you could only see about 5 feet ahead. And I just had a horrible day there. And then there was diarrhea and vomiting, and basically everything starting to go wrong because of the hyponatremia. So I had to drop out on the third day. But I did go back 2 years later. So at the time, I was pretty happy to stop because I was absolutely miserable. But then in the bus on the way back, after everyone had finished, they all had these big shiny medals, and I thought, okay, I've kind of got to come back and do that. I felt, I really missed out. So I signed up to the next one that I could get into, and that was 2 years later. And then that one went a lot better. At least I finished, and I got, I think, 13th overall. So at that stage, I realized that improvements were happening within the sport. And again, that's hyper motivating to see yourself improve.
Well, what were the biggest takeaways you had that you saw that you could improve on, or that you learned? What were those learning experiences that were able to help you a couple of years later?
I would say that for most people, probably pacing. For me, I think my pacing was fine. I just didn't realize the specifics of the race. No matter, and that's one of the great things about ultras, that every race is so different. You might be doing a really hot race, a really cold race, a jungle race. If you don't train for those specifics, then you could be a great runner. You could be an awesome marathoner, and be horrible running in the desert or horrible running in the mountains, because it's not the specific stuff that you're training for, whether that's muscle fitness, adaptation to altitude or heat or whatever it may be. So I think that was one of the things that I realized. I obviously tried to do some heat training, probably not enough, but I just didn't know enough about running in general and distance running. And particularly the hydration was the thing that caused the problem, that I just drank way too much, and that made me ill.
Yeah. What are some of the, a lot of people are signing up for races in different areas. So whether it's altitude, whether it's the mountains, is it just finding a way to put yourself on those? Like, for instance, got friends of mine who live in Florida and they may go sign up to do a mountain race. I mean, at that point in time, you just have to get creative in your training.
Definitely. I mean, it's always possible. You can train for any race, no matter where you live. But there may be repetitive elements to it. So, for example, if you live in Florida, biggest hill is something like 400 feet. You're probably going to struggle to get terrain that you can actually train on that is similar to a mountain race. And you're certainly not going to have any altitude. So to do that, you'd need to be thinking about steps in buildings, particularly tall buildings, stair steppers, treadmills. All of these things that you're going to have to do a lot more, because you don't have interesting terrain that you can use. So instead, you've got to be able to be a little bit more creative, try and keep it varied, but there's just less variation available. While someone who lives at the bottom of 10 different mountains has got a whole load of different trails they can use, keep it very different the whole time, keep it exciting and interesting. So I would say that there's nothing that holds anyone back from being able to do a race. But ultimately, if you want to be at the top level of any type of race, you've got to have the right type of terrain. You're not going to be a world-class skier if you live in the desert. So it's the same principle with anything. You've got to have those things conveniently enough that you can really do it very specifically. But if you're just trying to finish, you could train pretty much anywhere.
One of the things that, and I guess a lot of the ability to see things online is probably helped, but I think I did my first 50-mile race. I think it was in 2008, and I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, no idea. And was
that's the case with everyone. The first time you just have no idea what's going on, how it'll feel. Yeah, that's kind of the excitement, I think. That's one of the best things about ultras.
Exactly. And so it's amazing. And I like what you kind of learned from your first desert experience, and I kind of the same way. And how do you think this sport has grown over the years? Do you think there's so much information out there? So do you think a lot of people are still kind of uneducated of how to get to the finish in a lot of these ultra marathons?
I think there's so much more information now. So I started running in 2005. Where the internet was, there wasn't as much information out there, that people were still doing dial-up, that kind of thing. So I think now there's just more information because there's a lot more people in the sport. So there's more resources, there's so many more races, and it's something that people are more familiar with, even books about the subject. Born to Run, for example, that book came out, I think, 2008, 2009. So that's helped a lot of people understand a bit more about it and realize it's out there. But I think as well, what I do is for my living, I'm a coach, and it's an online coach for ultras in particular. That didn't really exist when I started. I mean, I can't think of anyone I could have gone to who could have helped me in a structured way. All I could do was ask a few friends who'd done some ultras and say, hey, what should I do about this? What shoes should I wear? That kind of thing.
So let me ask you, how have you over the years kind of formed your coaching philosophy? What does that look like? Is it just kind of experiences that have worked for you? Is it a combination of kind of what you've learned and read from some of the others as well?
It's very much trial and error is part of it. So, but then mixing that in with, I tried to research as much as I could. So things like Arthur Lydiard, Tim Noakes, the kind of books that don't just, it's largely marathon training because there's a lot more literature about that. But Tim Noakes in particular, with the Law of Running, focuses more on the ultra side of training. So it's interesting to see the science behind things and, challenge your own beliefs. So that I find is a fascinating part of it. And so every time I see any articles or scientific literature about training aspects related to ultras, and quite a lot of this comes out of Western States, 100 miler in particular, because they have a medical science program related to that race, because it's such extreme conditions. It's a pretty good place to test things, and it's very specific to what an ultra runner wants to know about. So I try to learn as much from that as possible. I got a personal training certification from the National Academy of Sports Medicine. I got a USATF coaching qualification. So it was trying to learn and really get all the information I could out there, and then 10 years of practicing it on myself, the community of people I run with, and also in the last 5 years where I've been coaching, each and every person I learn something from. So hopefully they learn something from me, but I'm definitely always refining it and realizing, the nuances of all the different circumstances that different people can be in.
Hey, for those who may not be aware, could you just share a little bit about the extremes of conditions that you and other athletes kind of experience in the Western States 100?
Sure. I mean, the temperature is probably the most famous thing there. So you start off in the mountains, then you go up to pretty high altitude. You go up to about 8,700 feet. So there's a good 30 or 40 miles of high altitude. And then you come a little bit lower and you hit the canyons, and then it's all about heat. So the temperatures in those canyons on a really hot day might be 115, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So seriously, seriously hot. And you're running in very remote areas. In some of these places, the only way you could get out if you, say, broke your leg would be a helicopter rescue. Wow. And then you go down to the river, and it's still very hot through to the end of the day. Even by about 9 p.m., it can still be extremely hot. Then it starts getting dark. On a colder year, it's not quite as extreme as that. But basically, yeah, you're looking at extreme temperatures, very exposed, very remote areas. There's potentially wildlife, bears. In fact, a couple of years ago, the female winner was stopped by a bear about a mile from the finish. And then the second, third, and fourth women all caught up, and they ended up having a bit of a sprint finish for those few positions because the bear was on a single track trail and they couldn't get past it. So there's rattlesnakes, cougars potentially. So it's pretty much out there, but it doesn't feel particularly, this sounds a bit weird, it doesn't feel dangerous. It just feels like it's things you have to manage.
Yeah, I have news for you. The bear always wins in my mind. So yeah, there's no doubt about that. Now, in those kind of conditions, do you dress? Are you dressing for the current? Are you changing as you go, or how are you dressing for a race like that? Typically,
I don't tend to change the clothes the whole lot. It's just through the heat of the day. I'm using ice and cold water at every single aid station. When I cross a stream or the river, I dunk myself completely in it to cool down. Some people will start off maybe with a light jacket because it can be a bit cold at dawn when you're going through the mountains. And then, a lot of the guys in particular are running topless for a large portion of the race. I just tend to be in running t-shirt the whole time, maybe with a light jacket early on, maybe some gloves. So it's not dramatic changes. I mean, a typical year I'd say might be 50 or 60 degrees in the early miles, and then 100 degrees in the hot part of the day. So you can get by with pretty much the same clothes. But there's things like an ice bandana, putting ice under a hat, having ice in a handheld and pouring that on your head as well as it melts. Those kind of things become much more important as the day heats up.
That's right. Now, whether it be the athletes at the front or just the regular athlete trying to get to the finish line, is there something that you've been able to see from your coaching experience? Is there something that these people have in common as just the ability to kind of push through, refuse to quit? What is there a common denominator between people who are successful in these races?
I think so. I think simply put, it's being stubborn. It's just not giving up. So as you hit adversity, you deal with it rather than you complain about it. And that's why I think ultras are a pretty good metaphor for life, that to be successful in an ultra, whether you're talking about someone with the cutoffs or someone at the front of the race, you've got to just go, okay, well, there's going to be difficulties today, so I'm going to deal with them. I'm going to get through them and manage them as well as I can. And that applies to absolutely everything you could ever do in life, whether it's your job, starting a business, writing a book, anything. It'll have an impact on making you more successful and happier, because rather than getting pulled down by any negatives, you let those things make you stronger and you feed off them.
Now, I'd love to talk, like I think I mentioned at the beginning, kind of my introduction to you was through the Grand Slam. And so now, correct me if I'm wrong, so it was the Western States 100, the Vermont 100, Leadville, and Hard Rock. Is that right? With those?
No, and Wasatch Front.
Wasatch. Okay, yeah. Gotcha. Can you talk about kind of the unique challenges? What kind of time frame were we talking with those 4 races?
So that's 10 weeks. From the first to the last day. It's typically 3 to 4 week gaps between the 100 milers. 3 of them are mountain races. One of them is in Vermont, lower altitude, but still has about 15,000 feet of climbing. So it's half of Everest. So it's not like it's a flat race. But they all have unique challenges. That's one of the things I think that really appeals about it, that you've got Western States where it's about heat and a huge amount of downhill because you start in the mountains and you finish close to sea level.
Right.
Then Leadville is all about altitude. That's the high altitude race, 10,000 feet plus for the majority of the race. Wasatch is just the hardest one in terms of it's got the most climbing, way more than any of the other races, more technical, arguably more beautiful as well, I'd say. Just a spectacular set of mountains east of Salt Lake City. And then Vermont is all about heat and humidity, but without any altitude and with all the hills being a lot smaller. So each of them has a unique challenge, and that's kind of one of the things that really appeals about it. But the whole idea was that it was originally the Grand Slam was the first 400 milers that existed. Oh. Then one of them got switched out, and instead Vermont, which was almost as old, jumped in instead. And so it's basically 4 of the original 100 milers in the US doing them in one summer, and then you add the time up. And it's just, it appeals in so many different ways for the challenge, for the variety, for the history of it. And so people have been doing this since the 80s.
Wow. Now, one of the things I enjoyed was getting to kind of read and listen to you and Nick Clark kind of going back and forth. But you guys, it seemed like you had a lot of fun doing that. Mm-hmm. And now, with each one of those races, how you talk about each one of them are different. Do you feel like there were any? Do you feel like your strengths as a runner, or were there certain courses that you were able to run real well? Did you feel some of your strengths coming through in a particular?
Yeah, courses? I mean, Nick and I have had so many close races over the years. Like we're usually very, very tight. But up to that point, I'd never beat him at Western States. So we'd both started doing it in 2010. He'd beaten me in 2010, 11, and 12. So 2013. You'd have to say he's probably the favorite to be ahead of me, but that was the first time I finished a bit ahead of him. I was 4th, he was 6th. Vermont, I thought would be more my type of thing because I've maybe got a little bit more speed on the flat stuff and he's a bit better on the steep stuff. So Vermont, I expected to beat him. He beat me by 3 minutes and he was 3rd, I was 4th. Leadville, he lives in Colorado. He lives at altitude. And again, there's lots of steep stuff, but also it is quite runnable. So I thought that was probably fairly even between us. That one I managed to beat him slightly. I got 1st and he got 2nd. And then Wasatch was definitely, I thought, would be his favorite because that's he's won it before, for one thing. I'd never been there. Yeah. And it's very much a mountain race with lots of steep stuff. So he won that and I came 2nd. So it was back and forth the whole way. I was ahead of him in 2. He was ahead of me in 2. But it wasn't necessarily the ones that we'd have expected to beat each other in.
Yeah, it was very entertaining, and you guys seem like good friends all the way through that. And
definitely, we had to give each other a little bit of a bit of crap and just make fun of each other a little bit. And I remember at Leadville, about mile 10, there was a procession of about 20 people in the early stages before it really broke out, and I passed Nick because I was stumbling over things because there was a line of people and it was easier to just run on my own. So I went past Nick and said, "Yep, see you at the finish." And just little things like that. You got to just play with each other a bit like that. And it was a lot of fun. And it made it so much more exciting, the fact that we had a back and forth rather than just one person doing it and it all going well. It was back and forth. It could have been either of us in the end that got the record. We both broke the record by about 5 hours, but I just broke it by a little bit more. So, it's very close until the end though. And he finished on the high with the win. But, we've known each other for years and both Brits as well. So it's unusual that it's two Brits who live in America who are racing this classic American series.
Hey, one of the things that I appreciate that you're doing is just kind of, we talked early on, when we first got started, there's hardly any information about how to do these things, and love how you're helping people. How do you complete these? How do you get to the finish? What inspired you to first start helping people with the ultra marathon coaching in the first place?
Well, I think, again, if you look back 5 or 6 years, there weren't really many coaches out there, particularly, marathon coaches, yes, track coaches, yes, but ultras, not so much. So it was mainly just as I started to get a little bit of success and have some races go well, I had friends of mine asking if I could give them some help or if I could coach them. And I said, well, I don't really do that. So I kind of got into it that way and then thought, well, if I'm going to do this properly, I should get some more qualifications and make it a little bit more formalized and make it more structured. So, that was starting back in 2010. So it was really just people asked me some questions and it got me thinking, okay, I've learned a few things. Maybe I can pass that knowledge on.
Yeah. One of the things we saw that you were doing was the coaching with Becoming Ultra. Is that right? Is that the series you guys are doing? And so we saw, you taking kind of not necessarily like an ordinary runner, but maybe a runner that's a little bit more mortal, like me and like Trey, but taking them to an ultra with the coaching. What's that process been like? I know you've gone through one season, and kind of let our listeners know kind of how that works.
Sure. So yeah, becoming ultra, the whole idea is it's helping a runner who's never even attempted an ultra to complete one. So the first season, we trained a couple of people up for the Aspen Power of 4 50K in Aspen, Colorado. And so they'd never done, I think that the runner that I coached, Jules, I think the longest she'd done was a half marathon. And so 50K is a lot longer than that. And this is a tough 50K. It was a high alpine. It was part of the US Skyrunner series. And so, yeah, it was really entertaining from my perspective to see that whole process, because most of the people who come to me have at least done a marathon, and then they're moving on to ultras, or they've done an ultra and they want to get quicker or do a longer distance. So yeah, it's really a lot of fun to work with someone like that and see not just them achieving stuff, but seeing them realize along the way what they're capable of. And so the second season that we're in at the moment, we've got 2 runners who are training up for American River 50 miler. So it's a slightly longer race, but a much flatter race. It's in California. It's only got about 2,000 or 3,000 feet of climbing. So it's much more runnable and flatter. But again, the idea is that the woman that I'm training, Janet, the longest she's done is a half marathon. So at this point, about 4 months away from the race, we're just gradually building up the mileage. And again, it's just all the things that she's going through that every runner goes through as they move up to marathons and ultras. And so it's letting people see that process and be guided through it, and seeing the difficulties that Janet has and how we overcome them and how we make her fitter and stronger and improve her endurance. And equally as much is about the mental side of it. So giving her the belief and the toolkit to be able to deal with what an ultra will throw at her, not just the legs to be able to run it.
Would you say, is it pretty equal mental and physical during the training, or would you say one's more dominant the more distance you get?
I would say that pretty much everyone can physically get to the point where they could run 50K, 50 miler, maybe even 100 miler. I think it really comes down to the mental side of it, of whether or not you can. Our bodies are capable of doing it. There's no doubt about that. So unless you've had both knees replaced or something like that, you can probably do it if you have sensible training that's built up and it's a good training program over an appropriate period of time, which would be different for a 400-pound man compared to a 150-pound man, for example. But yeah, I think it comes down to the will and a desire, and like I said, the stubbornness that they've got to be able to just push and not give up. And not everyone can do that. So I think that's the thing that you can't necessarily teach. You can encourage, and you can improve, and you can build that confidence through build-up races. So Janet, for example, is doing a marathon next month in the build-up to the 50K. But ultimately, if someone just doesn't commit to it or doesn't really want it enough, then you can't give them that passion and that desire.
Now, you also do the Skyrunner series, is that right?
Yeah.
Let us know a little bit more information about that, how that works.
So I've been doing that since it started in the US. Skyrunning's been around since the 90s, mainly a European thing, and it's really hardcore mountain running. I mean, the simplest way of putting it is you run to the top of a mountain and back down. That's kind of how it started off. Unlike a trail race that is maybe just on trails, particularly a lot of the European races, there's not trails necessarily for large parts of the course. And it is sometimes just literally, you've got to get to the summit of that mountain and back down. So we don't have quite as much flexibility in the US because of permitting, etc. But we're trying to get as close to that as possible, trying to get lots of off-piste running in there and high alpine, spectacular, beautiful running. So the series started in 2014. So we've had 2 seasons of that so far. We just completed the 2015 season. And so, yeah, for 2016, again, it's just making it bigger and better, more competitive, just an incredible set of races that cover the US. So we've got, I think, 7 different states all over the place. Obviously, a little bit more biased towards the high alpine areas, the Rockies, the West Coast in general. But we're just trying to encourage as much of this across the whole country as possible, and offer people something a little bit different to the standard trail races that are out there.
Now, are they supported, or are folks running with their own nutrition, their own gear?
Like a standard trail race, there's aid station. But these races are a little bit more rugged typically. So if you're going really high up, might be going over a pass or a peak that is a little bit more exposed. So it is, I think pretty much anyone can do it, but it helps to have a little bit more experience. So someone who lives in, again, let's use the example of Florida and hasn't run in the mountains before, it might be better to do one of the shorter distances and build up to the longer distances rather than just jump in at the deep end.
Gotcha. So you're not having to run with ropes and gear.
No. You don't have to be a climber to do them. It's definitely running races. The skyrunning stuff globally, they've actually increased the number of categories they have. So this year they've got a new extreme category, which is more like that, where it'll have sections of the trail that have chains and ropes and stuff. So it's, there's not a whole lot of running in those races. They're really, really rugged. But the majority of it, at least, it's running race. But there's a lot of hiking there because of how steep it is.
Gotcha. That's really cool. Is there a race that really stands out to you as one of your favorites? Like, is there a moment kind of in your running history, you're like, hey, this was awesome. This is one of my favorites.
I would say there's a couple of things. So finishing the Grand Slam, but it wasn't so much because it was awesome or the record. It's because I was done. And that was a long 10 weeks. And just knowing that it was over was a huge amount of relief that I hadn't screwed it up. I hadn't got injured. I hadn't DNF'd. But probably more from a fun perspective, I'd say the best run that I've had at Comrades in South Africa. So I've done it 6 times. I'm going back there again next year. And the best run I had there, I think, was 2011. And it's just one of those days where you feel like you've kind of nailed it. You've taken advantage of all your fitness. Your pacing was right. Every element of it, I think, got the most out of my body on the day. So that was something pretty special. And also when you've crossed the finish line and you've given it everything, and that you could probably have not even done another 100 meters, that's a great feeling.
What's the recovery like for you after one of those really long ultras?
It's less than it used to be. So again, the more I've trained, the more I've run 100 milers in particular, the quicker the recovery tends to be. So the first time I did a 100 miler, it took maybe, I'd say 6 months to feel fully recovered. Now I feel like I'm pretty much recovered within a month. And I think the Grand Slam probably puts that in perspective. Having had 3 to 4 weeks, I noticed the difference between 3 weeks later doing a race and 4 weeks later.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So 6 months now is less of an issue. But I think that it's definitely improved over time, that ability to recover. But it also depends on the intensity of the race, the type of terrain. A road race can actually hammer your legs a lot more. So Comrades being on roads and having a lot of downhill, that often hammers my legs as much as a 100 miler in the mountains, because it's a harder surface and you're running those downhills faster, even though the distance isn't nearly as long. So I would say 100 milers obviously take the longest to recover from, but a hard 50 or 60 mile road race, particularly a hilly one, can hammer the legs equally as much.
That's good. Well, we don't want to take up too much of your time, but we got a couple questions for you as kind of we close up here. One is there a resource that you would point runners to, whether it's a book or a training program, that you say, hey, this has been super beneficial to me, or this is really powerful, that you'd want to?
I think I mentioned it earlier. So the law of running, and LORE, as in so the history as well of running, by Professor Tim Noakes. And it's a big, thick book, but it's got a lot of fascinating stuff in there, great science behind it. And a lot of it has been research on Comrades, on Ironman. So it's much more applicable to an ultra runner. And that's probably the best book out there for learning more about ultras, I would say.
And then the last question is, so especially as you look more at maybe the runners that are doing the halves, like the ones you're coaching, or the marathons, is there a piece of advice that you would give them that would just really, really sticks out to you?
I would say pacing. That is the single biggest mistake people make. And this applies to road racing, to long distances. The longer the distance, typically, the bigger the penalty for screwing it up. That if you've gone out a little bit too hot in a 100 miler, you can pay for it with a death march or a DNF. So I think that's probably the simplest thing. That for a marathon, for example, you should be aiming to do a pretty even pace through the whole thing. It's going to be getting harder near the end, but if you end up slowing down significantly and the conditions haven't changed, so it is different if it's a hot day and it's cool at the beginning and it's boiling hot at the end, where you'd expect to slow down. But any other time, it's about just trying to refine pacing, practice it in the training runs, practice it with some short distance races to get a better sense of that as well. And then that's the thing that tends to make the biggest difference for people, whether it's a half marathon all the way through to a 100 miler.
Ian, just one final question as we close. One of the things you mentioned earlier was just, hey, being able to develop mentally to be able to do these events? Is that, I imagine there's no secret recipe to that. Is it truly just doing the little things over time? Is that the best way to develop yourself mentally where you feel like you can finish these events?
I think so, yes. Build up to it. Don't feel like just because you've read a book about 100 milers that you need to do that immediately. Maybe do a 50K, then a 50 mile, then a 100K, and spread it out over a few years. There's no rush to jump in there at the deep end. And it's going to make each step feel much more manageable if you've done a build up to it. You've learnt lessons along the way of what it feels like in a 50 miler, what it feels like in a 100K in the latter stages. There's always going to be a learning curve as you move up to a harder or a longer race. But why not enjoy the process? Why not get the satisfaction of doing your first 50K, and that's a big deal, rather than you jump in at the 100 mile and then you feel, 50K, I can do that. That's nothing. It's worth getting that progression. And I took about 5 or 6 years between doing my first ultra and doing my first 100 miler. And I think that's a pretty sensible way to do it. There's no rush to jump in there, even though 100 milers have that kind of magical allure to people that they stand out as being the distance in many cases. And I totally appreciate that, but still no rush to do that. Why not enjoy the other stuff in the build-up? There's such incredible races at every distance all over the world that take advantage of that, and also keep enjoying that even after you go longer. There's a lot of different aims you can have in racing. Just running longer shouldn't be the only one.
That's great. Well, Ian, I'm very, very grateful for your time today, and thankful for what you do for the running community. And if I get passed by Elvis or Spider-Man or the Gladiator, I'll know it's probably you. So best of luck. Hey, what's the best way people can follow along with you? We'll certainly put all the links in the show notes. So what's the best way that runners can follow with you as well?
Sure. Well, the easiest way is on Twitter. So it's my last name and my first name, Sharman Ian. Or Facebook again, that's Ian Sharman. That's my page on there. And then the coaching is sharmanultra.com. So play on words on the toilet paper because people pronounce it very similarly.
That's good. Awesome. Well, Ian, thanks again for your time. And hey, best of luck in your training.
Thanks, guys. That was fun.
Thanks, Ian.